And
I can only see your picture there.
oh, don't worry. I have I'm using OBS, and OBS has your picture and mine side by side. Even though for yours, it's like the feed is just showing my little image, my icon. But from the
Oh,
standpoint of the audience, they can see both of us side by side. And
okay.
let me make sure I blow this up to be as big as it possibly can. And all right, and we go from yeah, this way we can balloon this. In fact, I can even bounce it back and forth between us where your picture is enlarged. Here we are. There we go. Okay, and I can send you the link for this if you like.
Sure.
We
Sure.
are. Let me make this live. And come on, come on, come on. Where is it? Where is it? Where is it? Where is it? All right, why am I not live? Okay, yeah, it's showing us to be live, and I'm gonna make this open so that other people can see it. Here we are. Public. Okay. All right. So we are live. Let me send you the link to the video. Come on, come on, come on. And we can kick this show on the road. All right. And the link is. Okay, how do I send? Oh, here we are. Chat. Okay. I just sent the link via Skype.
Okay.
So you should have it from there. Okay. And like I said, I'm going to bounce back and forth between us as we're talking. The audience can see both of us. Um,
Sounds
you,
good.
yeah, my little icon. But let me introduce you, and we'll go from here. All right, guys. Welcome to the Progressive Soapbox. My name is Jamarl Thomas, and I have an amazing guest for us today. I have Peter Kuznick. He's professor of history and director of the Nuclear Studies Institute at American University. He and Oliver Stone co-authored the 10-part Showtime documentary film series and the book, both titled The Untold History of the United States. He's also provides regular commentary for all major U.S. and international media. We're joined with Peter Kuznick. Peter, once again,
Glad to be with you, Jamari.
and I am glad to have you like nobody's business. We had the opportunity to talk on fault lines for a bit. And we were having this conversation on Ukraine, and I got to be honest, the conversation was not long enough by any stretch of the imagination. And you actually had a really interesting take, which made me really want to get into the conversation about maybe correctness is not the right word for it, but definitely on the pressures that either Russia was dealing with, Ukraine was dealing with, that basically drove the conflict in the first place for the reason why basically Russia decided to invade. Not to mention the things that were taking place from the standpoint of NATO and the way that they were kind of poking the bear, as the terminology is basically being used. And so I definitely want to step into it. When you were on Fault Lines with us, you kind of made this point that this invasion, maybe unnecessary wasn't the right word for it. But from your standpoint, what is the context and the rationale for the invasion of Ukraine? And does Putin have a point in that rationale?
I would say Putin has a strong point in objecting to NATO expansion. He's got a strong point in objecting to the way Russia has been isolated and treated as a pariah state by the West. He's got a strong point in terms of his objections about other things that the West is doing, but he has no case at all to justify his invasion of Ukraine. He's been making this point about his anger over the way the United States and NATO have treated Russia. He's been making this point for publicly for at least 15 years. And the West didn't listen. He stated it very clearly in 2007 at the security conference in Munich, in which he said that the U.S. is acting like a hyper-militarized unipolar player in the world, and that NATO expansion cannot be tolerated. What did the U.S. do? It ignored it. And in 2008, George W. Bush talks about expanding NATO to Georgia and Ukraine. Putin responds with the invasion of Georgia, and still people didn't take it seriously. Ukraine had always been very, very important for Russia, but the West saw Ukraine as a prize. In fact, if you look at the writings by Hadley, Libby, Wolfowitz, or if you look at Zbigniew Brzezinski's Grand Chessboard in 1997, he says Russia will never again be a Eurasian power if it doesn't have Ukraine. So there's been an ongoing effort to wrest Ukraine away from the Russian sphere of influence. And in 2013 and 2014, after Putin made a counteroffer to Yanukovych, after he had signed the agreement with the EU, Putin made him a better deal, and he signed the agreement with Russia instead of the EU. At that point, there was an uprising in Ukraine, and it was led by various groups. Some were pro-Western for the right reasons, because they wanted higher standards of living, they wanted more freedom, they wanted more democracy, and some were right-wing militarist groups, and even with a smattering of neo-Nazis in there. But with the uprising at Maidan, which was egged on by Victoria Nuland, and Joe Biden, as vice president, was our point man on Ukraine. At that point, Russia takes Crimea back because Khrushchev had given Crimea to Ukraine in 1954 as an act of stupidity or largesse on his part. And then Russia supports the uprisings in the Donbass. From that point on, the sanctions were imposed, and Russia was very much on the outs. In 2018, when Putin makes his State of the Nation address, March 1st, 2018, and announces that Russia now has 5 new nuclear weapons, all of which can circumvent U.S. missile defense, he says very clearly, you didn't listen to us. You'd better listen to us now. We still weren't listening. And what's happened since that point has only reinforced Putin's sense of paranoia and isolation. Initially, when Zelensky got elected president in 2019, he reached out to Russia. He ran as a Russian speaker who would improve relations with Russia and resolve the crisis over Ukraine. And he started to reach out to Russia. Nationalist forces inside of Ukraine protested so vociferously that he backed down. And not only that, at that point, he welcomed increased military aid from NATO, increased number of trainers from more than a dozen NATO countries, and increasingly hostile relations with Russia. And so we saw this coming. Russia had previously built up troops on the border, and now did it again this fall. And I and others were urging Putin not to be so stupid as to invade. In fact, I did, I think, 75 Russian TV shows, interviews in the 3 months leading up to the war with all the Russian troops on the border. And I would say to Putin, or to the audience, that Putin had finally gotten the world to talk about Russia's legitimate national security concerns that had been trampled on for a long time, for decades at least. And the West could do it after 1990 because Russia was so weak after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And I said that Putin should declare victory, say that now the world is talking about this, Zelensky has already said that Ukraine won't join NATO and is talking about neutrality, which is Putin's big demand, no NATO expansion to Ukraine and Ukraine becoming neutral. And Putin had already declared independence of Luhansk, Donetsk. I thought that was a mistake. I thought that the Minsk II agreement, which Zelensky had not been willing to further negotiate on, was a much better agreement for Russia to keep Luhansk and Donetsk within Ukraine to act as a brake against Ukraine's further integration into NATO and the EU, if that was what they wanted. And then Putin should take the troops off the border, diffuse tensions, and begin negotiations. But that's not what he did. And if you listen to what he was saying in his talks the week before the invasion, he was sounding delusional. He was sounding unhinged, talking about genocide in the Donbass. There was a lot of fighting going on there. Both sides were shelling each other. It was a bad situation. There had been a truce, that a ceasefire that seemed to be working. It stopped working there toward the end, but there was no genocide against Russian speakers or pro-Russian elements there. He talked about also this angry speech about Ukraine. He had written that article earlier about Ukraine not being an independent country, being part of Russia. That's not the case. And certainly the Ukrainians don't see it that way. And then he also talked about being very, very extreme kinds of things about Ukraine being run by neo-Nazis and drug dealers. I mean, he was sounding to me unhinged, and that was frightening. Because when a man's got his hands on the nuclear button with 6,000 nuclear weapons, I mean, that's a pretty dangerous situation. And for somebody in that position to be sounding as irrational as Putin was sounding.
Right.
Now, as I said in some of my talks, he maybe was taking a page from Richard Nixon's madman thesis and acting more irrational and unhinged than he really was, in order to send a message to the West so they would back down and agree to his demands, which he had issued publicly in December. But we didn't know, and we still don't know. And one of the things that I lose the most sleep over in this crisis is Russia's nuclear threats. I mean, nobody should be making nuclear threats under any circumstance.
Agreed.
Especially in a crisis situation like this. Putin is being completely irresponsible and almost a kind of lunacy to be making nuclear threats of that sort. But I think we've got to all back off. We've got to come to a negotiated agreement, get Russia's troops out of there, restore peace in Ukraine, negotiate the end of this war, and diffuse the nuclear threats there's more discussion now of nuclear war than there's been in almost 60 years since the Cuban Missile Crisis. And it's real. This is a real, as UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres said last week, said the prospect of nuclear conflict, once unthinkable, is now back within the realm of possibility. We're hearing this from everybody. And so sane people have got to stop this before it goes any further.
That part, I absolutely agree with you on. That this kind of nuclear talk and everything else is extremely hyperbolic. But I do want to get into, okay, I want to unpack some of that. I think you'd agree with me, I mean, even based on your own statement, that there was, or there has been for the last, 30, 40 years, this kind of encirclement of Russia. And this is after assurances that were made, I mean, basically by not just Baker, by several people, even within Europe, that NATO would not expand. This is not something that's going to happen. And by my assessment, they said that because they understood that Russia had severe security concerns at the point where the Soviet Union collapsed. And yet, the West basically blew that off, ignored it, and in this kind of radical triumphalism, decided to basically surround, even up to the point of knocking over the Ukrainian government. And so if you're Russia in this case, and you're looking at what's basically taking place, and you've seen all of these countries get gobbled, you've seen your security concerns ignored, you've seen Trump pull out of one deal or one missile treaty after the next, you've seen the US go around the globe kicking over countries, for one, or for that matter, putting in military in another. And then you see that this government that's extraordinarily hostile to Russian interests. And I agree with you with the genocide. I took the genocide statement by Putin as kind of tweaking the West because of the way they kept saying China was committing genocide. Oh, China's committing genocide. The U.S. would say it in a heartbeat. Trump would say it in a heartbeat. Didn't have much to show for it, and yet they would say it almost in this kind of geopolitical thing. And so it's like if your country is continuously getting surrounded, your security guarantees are being ignored, you say NATO or Ukraine cannot be part of NATO, and everybody blows you off, not just blows you off. What Zelensky said recently was that behind the scenes, they kept telling Zelensky, you'll never be a part of NATO. In front of the camera, the doorway is open. I guess my thing is, what should he have done? Because saying we won doesn't really stop Ukraine from being integrated into NATO. And tell me if I'm wrong. I mean, maybe,
a couple of things.
Go for it.
First of all, I have to, as a historian, take issue with the black and white picture you paint about 1990, 1991, and NATO expansion.
Go for it, please.
Yes. Baker did say that NATO will not expand 1 inch to the east. However, Gorbachev never got that in writing, and so that was said initially, but Gorbachev has indicated that that was never part of the actual official agreement. U.S. policymakers, even hawks like Paul Nitze, said that this was a terrible thing for NATO to expand. George Kennan, the architect of the Cold War, said it would be a strategic blunder, the greatest strategic blunder we'd ever made, to expand NATO.
Now, why? Explain why that would be a strategic blunder.
It was a strategic blunder because, first of all, in the mid-1990s, when these things were being talked about, and you have to remember that after we knew that most of the Russian leaders believed they had an agreement not to expand NATO.
Exactly.
And for the U.S. to do it, especially in the 1990s, after Gorbachev is out, sadly, because he's one of my heroes, and Gorbachev gave Oliver and me the first blurb we got on Untold history, which I was very, very proud of. But even Yeltsin, who was, if anything, rolled over for the U.S. throughout the 1990s, even Yeltsin made a big issue about not expanding NATO, how angry he was about NATO expansion. But Russia was weak, and the U.S. took advantage. And the U.S. kicked sand in Yeltsin's face, and they did that to Russia. And in 1999, despite so many American diplomats saying this was a terrible thing to do, treat our friendly country, Russia, as if it's an enemy by expanding NATO and humiliating it in the process. And in 1999, we expanded to Czechoslovakia, Czech Republic, and Hungary and Poland. But still, Russia was friendly. And when Putin comes to office in late 1999, early 2000, after the U.S. was hit on 9/11, the first international leader to reach out and talk to George Bush and offer support was Vladimir Putin. And he's even talking at that point about Russia joining NATO, crazy as that might seem in retrospect. And then they helped us in Afghanistan, actually, during the initial invasion. And then in 2002, how does the U.S. repay him? Repays Putin by abrogating the ABM Treaty, which Putin thought was absolutely essential to the post-war order. 2003, U.S. invades Iraq over the objections not only of France and Germany, old Europe, as Rumsfeld made fun of them, but also over Russia's strong objections. 2004, expand NATO further, 7 more countries, including former Soviet republics in the Baltics. So, yes, I'm agreeing with you that U.S. policy was irresponsible, reckless, and very, very threatening to Russia.
Exactly. And that's kind of what I want to hit at.
Question about that. However, for Putin to risk world peace, based upon this illusion, I mean, Putin was in a bubble. For 2 years, he didn't really see anybody. You saw those images of him meeting with his top security officials. What are they, 75 feet away? At the other end of the table? Putin wouldn't get near human beings. He was in this bubble of his own in which people were afraid to tell the truth to him, to give him any honest intelligence reports. And he goes in there thinking that, just like the Americans believed when we went into Iraq, that we were going to be greeted as liberators. That didn't happen.
I know, but Peter, I guess my thing is whether we're going to be greeted as liberators, whether Putin was in a bubble, on Mars by himself for like a year or two, it's still the situation that he's dealing with a real reality that his country is being encircled. And not just encircled.
That's where I think you're wrong, because Zelensky already knew that NATO was not going to expand. Yeah, of course, it was absurd for Biden and for NATO to not state publicly the obvious.
Exactly.
Ukraine was not going to join NATO. They could have even said, they're trying to preserve this principle, the open door principle. Where does America's open door policy go back to? The late 1898, 1899, when Secretary of State John Hay issues the open door notes saying that the U.S. wants to have access to the world economy, and we want to have, we want the open door policy, which leads to our initial invasion of China as part of the Boxer Rebellion.
Right.
So they wanted this principle. They're holding on to this principle. I said, this is absurd. We can avoid a war. We can avoid an invasion. We can avoid the destruction of the beautiful country of Ukraine by simply saying that Ukraine is not going to join NATO, that Ukraine is going to be neutralized, and that NATO is not going to expand any further to the east. Of course, they should have done that. There's so much blame to go around. I'm not saying that Putin was not responding to what was a real threat. I'm saying that this specific threat was off the table. Putin knew they were not going to expand to include Ukraine. Even in his lifetime, it wasn't going to happen. So for him to invade on that pretext, based on all these illusions, was an act of madness and criminality. And immorality, and look what he's done to Russia. The Russian economy is largely in tatters. Russia's moral position in the world has been totally undermined. Russia's military is now a punchline. The fact that they couldn't do anything there, they should have known that. The U.S. wasn't able to win in Vietnam. We see what happens. Nationalist countries with strong nationalist sentiments fighting on their own turf are going to be able to defeat or to have a standoff with an invader. Look at how much we put into the fight in Vietnam.
Well, a few things.
Do you know that when McNamara came into my class some years ago, former Secretary of Defense McNamara, who's considered the architect of that war, he said that he accepts that 3.8 million Vietnamese died in that war. 3.8 million. So we're talking about an act of colossal immorality. And what this one is not an act of immorality on the same scale yet. And we want to end this before it gets close to that scale, or even to the scale of U.S.-backed weapons killing people in Yemen. But this is the immediate threat. And unlike other crises, this one really can spill over into a full-scale global nuclear war.
And that terrifies me.
Even more dangerous, more reckless than the other invasions.
No, that part terrifies me. I guess my thing would be, they weren't unreal threats. Meaning, just because the United States or just because the EU would say, we're not going to be a part of NATO behind the scenes, it didn't stop them from doing to the hilt, integrating Ukraine into NATO. So whether Ukraine is being added part of NATO as de facto, like where we're just going to put weapons and mercenaries and training, etc., where we're going to have these guys integrated, whether they call it that or whether it just is that in practice, I honestly don't see the difference in those things. I mean, is there a difference between, let's say, Ukraine is part of NATO and Ukraine is not part of NATO, but in both situations, it is armed to the teeth and integrated into the system?
Well, it wasn't integrated into the system in any technical military sense. And they weren't even giving it the serious, heavy NATO artillery. Now, Zelensky made a mistake by intensifying the demand for Ukraine to join NATO, and he should not have done that. Zelensky is making a huge mistake now by talking about no-fly zones.
Oh, man, yeah.
When I say to that, that's equally insane with Putin's insanity, and that I say is that by saying that, the United States has shown that we're willing to fight to the last Ukrainian.
Yes, right.
But a no-fly zone, Zelensky is saying he's willing to fight to the last American, because that means World War III, which also means he's willing to fight to the last person on this planet, which is, insane also. But Zelensky has been a leader, a brave leader of a country at war, and the Ukrainian resistance has been heroic. And we have to give them credit for that. But what needs to be done to preserve Ukraine, because Putin has shown that he's willing to level parts of Ukraine. Most of his long distance bombing has been military targets, but a lot of the shorter distance artillery and rockets has been hitting civilian targets. And that's unconscionable and has to be stopped as quickly as possible. But the ability for the Russian military to function in a more effective way has been a shock to most military analysts around the world.
Well, to be fair, most of the people who are looking at it, especially when they're looking at what Russia was trying to accomplish, they went in soft. I mean, there's a new article out in Newsweek that kind of goes into where Russia could decimate Ukraine if they wanted to. They chose not to do that because their objective wasn't necessarily to destroy or kill civilians. Their objective was to smash the military.
Yeah.
And so the West has been reporting this in this kind of really weird and warped way, whereas the people who have been on the ground, or the people who have been nearby, or just military people, they're trying to accomplish their objectives. For example, the majority of the military or the fighting that's taking place in the East, where the majority of the Ukrainian military has basically been surrounded or is being surrounded by the Donetsk, Luhansk, and the Russian military. Well, the West is only talking about like Kiev and the stuff that's taking place on the Western side. I mean, and maybe I even take issue with that part, that they're liberators. For example, I don't consider what took place with Yanukovych being taken out in 2014. I consider that a coup. If that was here in the United States, and you had a situation where Donald Trump basically has his people to raid the Capitol and the government is overthrown, nobody would look at that as a revolution of dignity. They would say that was a coup. The elected president was basically taken out. The president elected by the East and the West was taken out. That's why I look at it as a coup. I consider that.
And Oliver and I talk about it as having been a coup in 2014 and having been the culmination of U.S. policy for years. And we cite an article in the Financial Times, conservative publication, and said that the agreement with the EU was the culmination of years and years of the West trying to wrest Ukraine from the Russian order.
Yeah.
And it succeeded at that point. However, when we talk about the military performance, that 40-mile caravan and the maneuvering around Kiev has been logistically a disaster. The number of Russian generals who apparently have been killed is really off the charts and unanticipated. The fact that they are in such a stalemate in several of the cities, Kharkiv, Kiev, even trying to get to Odessa. Yes, the Russian military was considered before this to be the second most potent military in the world. But the fact that they can't even defeat Ukraine is, to me, a real embarrassment.
But Peter, I guess that's my point. The objective of it wasn't to smash Ukraine. And that's kind of the point that I'm getting at. The objective wasn't to basically overwhelm the cities or flatten the cities. The objective was, in some cases, surround. In other cases, to smash and go after the military. That's kind of the point that I'm getting at. The Western media has been reporting it as, oh, they can't even take Ukraine. And it's like, well, the goal isn't to do what we did in, like I say, Iraq or something. Whereas, we're hitting power stations, we're destroying infrastructure. We're going. That wasn't their objective. I mean, if we're looking at it from the standpoint of, okay, the Russian military wants to completely flatten and destroy Ukraine. Well, that's a different temperament. Meaning, if they went in that way, that was one thing. I never got this impression that their objective was basically to do that, though. I mean, but tell me if I'm wrong.
Well, no, they. I mean, that's what I've said all along. If their goal was really to kill civilians, then they could be doing this on a vastly expanded scale.
Agreed.
That has not been what they were trying to do, although in places like Mariupol, it looks like maybe that is what they're trying to do.
Well,
But
going after neo-Nazis.
in general, that has not been their strategy, fortunately, because this could be a lot uglier.
Yeah.
If we think of the number who are killed in, let's say, Yemen, where it's about 300,000 in that vicinity,
Oh wow.
number who are killed in Ukraine of Ukrainians has been a tiny fraction of that, which is why I'm saying we have to end this before this turns into a much more horrific bloodbath. So you see, yeah, there's no question that Russia could be inflicting far more damage than it's inflicting.
How do we close this? If this needed to come to some kind of end, is this a situation where Zelensky needs to acquiesce to, hey, we're not going to be part of NATO, Crimea is Russia, and the Donets are independent, Donetsk and Luhansk? Is it a situation where the U.S. should put pressure on Zelensky to be more open and willing to negotiate? Is it a situation where Russia should try to come to some kind of peace agreement? Like, what's our pathway out of this to prevent this from turning into World War III? Because I agree with you on that. That freaks me out like nobody's business, and it can easily escalate.
What I've been saying, and I said this in an article I wrote for Responsible Statecraft last week, is that the only international leader who's actually got leverage over Vladimir Putin and can maybe bring him to his senses is Xi Jinping. Xi Jinping has got very good relations with Ukraine. China recognized Ukraine's sovereignty. China's got extensive investments in Ukraine, Belt and Road Initiative, lots of trade. In fact, China in 2019 replaced Russia as Ukraine's biggest trading partner. So he's got good relations with Ukraine. He's Putin's best friend and closest ally in the world. So he's the one who can actually do this, and it would be in his best interest to do so. Right now, Xi Jinping is viewed very negatively around the planet. When people think about China, they don't think about the Belt and Road Initiative and the economic growth. They think about Xinjiang and the Uyghurs. They think about the South China Sea. They think about Taiwan. They think about 300 million surveillance cameras, the repression inside Hong Kong. So China's image is very negative. If Xi Jinping will aggressively put himself forward as the peacemaker and resolve this crisis and give his friend Putin the on-ramp that Putin needs desperately right now, I think Xi Jinping and China will benefit enormously from this. And I've been urging Biden, instead of making threats constantly about what we're going to do to China and what we're going to do here and there and more sanctions, that what Biden should be doing is offering inducements to Xi Jinping. And for example, when Biden came to office, he doubled down on Trump's trade war. That was a mistake. And Biden should be saying, we're going to do away with the trade war and begin to work with you. We're going to start to talk to you more, in a less bellicose way about Taiwan. There's so many things that Biden can do to improve relations with China, that will be in China's interest and America's interest, and help potentially resolve this crisis. So I've been on Chinese TV, I guess 7 or 8 times in the last 2 weeks, talking about this. And somebody there is listening, obviously, and approves, because they keep inviting me back. The other person who can have some positive influence is Modi. I'm not a Modi fan by any means. In the 2 years before the pandemic, I made 3 extended speaking tours in India. Untold History. Our book is out in English in India, of course, but also in Marathi and in Bengali. And I've been on Indian TV 5 times in the past week or so, again, urging Modi to get actively involved. If Modi and Xi Jinping together try to exert some influence over Putin, I think this could end within a couple of days. And the terms that you're talking about, yeah, neutrality, no NATO. Zelensky is digging in his heels about Crimea and the Donbass. He's going to have to be much more flexible because Russia already controls those. So he can object in principle and they can agree to disagree about that. And Russia and the West can give security guarantees to Ukraine of a sort they don't have now. And the denuclear and the demilitarizing, some of that will go on. Denazification, I'd be happy to see them get rid of the Azov Brigade and some of the others, but it's not run by Nazis. And the people around Zelensky aren't Nazis. And, so there's room for negotiation. And there's room for everybody to say this is a win. Biden can talk about how united NATO is and that the United States is back, like he's been wanting to say. Putin can say he got them to acknowledge his security concerns. Zelensky can say he's brought peace, prosperity, and democracy, hopefully, at some point, to Ukraine. So I can see that in China, Xi Jinping can be seen as the world's peacemaker. And I remember when Trump wanted Prime Minister Abe from Japan to nominate him for the Nobel Peace Prize. Maybe we can get the Kishida, the new Prime Minister of Japan, to nominate Xi Jinping for the Nobel Peace Prize. And, but in the nuclear age, we cannot have war. I mean, it's just too dangerous, especially war between nuclear powers and their allies.
Yeah, it's far too destructive. I mean, for even to tempt fate on that. So I totally agree with you on that. I guess I think I disagree with you with some of this stuff. I mean, but I do appreciate definitely the conversation on it with somebody who I definitely respect and who definitely knows the historical context for all of this. I guess my thing is some of the stuff that's taking place from the standpoint of point of views from the West is not necessarily indicative of the rest of the world. Meaning, I get the demonization that's basically going to be taking place from China and the U.S. I mean, they call it the China virus. They say, oh, they're taking our jobs. Trump went so far as to say they're throwing Chinese people out of airplanes to infect Americans. I mean, this stuff has just been obscene, to put it mildly. But look, I agree with this idea of cooler heads prevailing and trying to bring this to a close. It's an utter tragedy. Do you think those cooler heads will prevail? And do you think that people will come to their senses? Because I got to be honest. To me, part of the reason and rationale that Putin went in the first place was for the exact things that you articulated. Instead of coming to these people with, hey, we would like to do this, it's, we're going to destroy you if you don't do this. And no country wants to be talked down to, especially with China recently, where the U.S. was threatening, we're going to destroy your country with sanctions, there are going to be consequences, as opposed to, hey, can you help us deal with the issue with Ukraine since you have a relationship with Russia and Ukraine? We don't do that way. We don't function that way.
The world is changing.
Yeah.
And in March of this year, Wang Yi and Yang Jiechi met in Anchorage with Sullivan and
Blinken. Yeah.
And Blinken gives his opening 2-minute remarks dressing down China. And Wang Yi, I think it might have been Yang Jiechi, went on for 16 and a half minutes in a diatribe.
He was very angry. Yeah, he was very angry.
Who the F do you think you are to talk to us this way? You can no longer talk to us from a position of strength. I think the United States has got to wake up and understand that it's one major player in a multipolar world. And one of the things that I think this war has done is reduce the number of major players from 3 to 2. I think it's now the U.S. and China. I think Russia has been so weakened and undermined by this geostrategic catastrophe on Putin's part that Russia is, its nuclear arsenal but it doesn't have much else going for it now. Russia's position in terms of energy with Europe is going to be greatly weakened, and the world is going to try to get off fossil fuels even faster than it was doing before, which is a good thing. And I think Russia's going to be, in some ways, more of a second-rate power going forward than it was a first-rate power.
We'll see about that one. Oh man, I so disagree with that because I don't think it's not that I love the war. In fact, I hate it. I hate the fact that this is taking place. I find it to be senseless, if I'm being bluntly honest. I mean, you have this like the notion that Zelensky would, as they say, poke the bear, like continuously knowing full well behind the scenes that Ukraine wasn't going to be a part of NATO because they kept telling him that, and yet continuously pushing and bringing in weapons and whatnot. Yeah, it's problematic. And even from the standpoint of the neo-Nazis, I mean, my assessment was never that. I think I always said sympathetic to Russophobic or these kind of elements that have been integrated into the various battalions or the military of Ukraine. In a very specific point. I guess my thing is, I don't see this as, I think, the blunder that I think you see it as. I mean, I see it as something almost on some level out of necessity. I mean, I guess my thing is, at which point does Putin respond after the West basically completely ignores their security concerns and have been doing so for decades?
I think Putin had won that one. I think the West had now understood how serious he and Russia were
Right.
about those issues, and he could have claimed victory,
And called it a
take
day.
off the border, saved his economy, saved his moral position to some extent,
Yeah.
and not subjected his military to this
No, I
embarrassment.
understand. Peter, I want to thank you very much for this. Oh,
By the-
please. Oh yeah, thank you very much. The voice that you guys are listening to, or the picture that you guys were seeing, Peter Kuznick. He's professor of history and director of the Nuclear Studies Institute at American University. He and Oliver Stone co-authored the 10-part Showtime documentary film series and book titled The Untold History of the United States. He regularly provides commentary for all U.S. major international media. Again, Peter, thank you again for this. I really appreciate it.
It was fun, Maury. Take care.
Thank you. All right, guys. This was Peter Kuznick. I wanted to bring him on because I wanted to have a conversation with him about basically to extend the conversation for fault lines. And so he was nice enough to do it. And I want to thank all of you, and I want to thank him. Him and I clearly disagree on a lot of this. Again, not so much that I think the war is great. In fact, I think the war is senseless. I think it is pointless endeavor. I think Zelensky full well knew. I think the West full well knew. I think all of those guys decided to expand to the border knowing full well that that was going to be an issue going back decades. But I wanted to have a conversation with him because I wanted to talk to somebody that was far more skeptical of the conflict and the rationale behind the conflict while simultaneously having this kind of in-depth historical context that can step through it, that can explain it, and they can make their point that much more clear. So I definitely have appreciated him joining us on the show. It says, Jamarl, I've missed these non-fault lines lives. Yeah, I'm going to be doing them more often. The studio is set up downstairs. I was having trouble getting my internet started today. We were supposed to start at like 3 o'clock. And so he was nice enough to still come on afterwards. But yeah, man, having the channel downstairs is massively exciting to me. Yeah, Untold History of the United States was incredibly eye-opening. Hash Rebel, yeah, it was. I was telling Peter, I was like, dude, I am such a big fan of yours. Untold History was astonishing. And it honestly really does give you this kind of context of what history could have been and what things could have turned out to be. And for that matter, giving a little bit more historical context as opposed to the way we've been typically taught history in the United States. So no, he's astonishingly good. Hash Rebel, 27 million Russians died fighting the Germans. Yes, absolutely. Guys, I am going to end this here. I want to thank all of you for joining us. I want to thank Peter again for joining us, Peter Kuznick. And I'll see you guys a little bit later. Thanks all. Like, share, and of course, subscribe.